They said she had no place left to go, that no man would ever let her stay. But under the lonely skies of Wyoming, she found a ranch, and a man who'd already stopped believing in anything except his dog. He told her coldly, "You're only here to cook." But when his German shepherd looked at her, something changed. He saw the bruises on her arms, and suddenly the walls he built began to crack. What happened next wasn't just love, it was a miracle. A story about second chances, faith, and the quiet ways God works through broken people and loyal hearts. Stay till the end, because the final scene will remind you that no matter how dark your storm is, God's light can still find you. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so more souls can feel His miracles too. The wind howled across the high plains of Wyoming, sweeping through fields of brittle grass that had long forgotten the taste of rain. The sky was an endless, blinding stretch of pale blue, the kind that seemed to burn rather than shine. In the distance, mountains crouched beneath the haze, their outlines blurred by dust. The land here was honest in its cruelty. It offered nothing freely, and what it did give had to be earned with blood, sweat, and years of silence. Down the cracked road that split the prairie in two, a lone figure walked beneath the punishing sun. Grace Miller, 25, carried a canvas bundle tied with twine and the kind of weariness that no rest could fix. She was of medium height, slender but not frail, her shoulders squared as if defying the weight of her own life. Her once blonde hair had dulled to a sandy brown from weeks under the open sky, and her skin, once soft, was now roughened, marked by sun and wind. Her eyes were gray, the color of rain that never fell. Each step she took pressed deeper into the dust, as though the earth itself wanted to claim her. Grace had left everything behind 3 weeks earlier. Her husband's house, his fists, his threats whispered like prayers after dark. The scars on her wrist, still faint but real, told of the rope he once used to keep her from running. Now she ran still, but not from him. She ran toward whatever scrap of life might let her breathe without fear. Ahead, the Walker Ranch appeared. Low wooden buildings slouched against the wind, the fences broken in places, the corral half empty. A weather-beaten sign swung from a single chain: Walker and Son Livestock. The and Son had been scratched out with a knife. The story of that missing name lingered in the air like dust. A sharp bark split the silence. From behind the barn came a German shepherd, tall and lean, his coat a deep mix of sable and black, his eyes an intelligent amber that caught every movement. His name was Rex, 5 years old, trained once for police work, but retired early after an injury to his hind leg. The limp was barely noticeable now, but it gave him a strange, deliberate grace. He stood still for a long moment, assessing the stranger at the gate, the fur along his back lifting slightly. Grace froze. "Easy, boy," she murmured, voice soft but steady. Rex's ears twitched. Instead of growling, he lowered his head, nose twitching as if he could smell her exhaustion, her quiet pain. Then he sat. The tension left the air as quickly as it had entered. The cabin door creaked open, and Ethan Walker stepped out. He was 36, but looked older, the sun and loss carving their marks deep into his face. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, built from years of hard labor, but there was a stiffness in his right arm, a leftover from a military injury he never spoke about. His jaw was strong, rough with a day's worth of stubble, and his dark hair had begun to gray at the temples. A faint scar traced down from his left eyebrow, disappearing into the shadow of his cheek. His eyes, a hard shade of steel blue, missed nothing. Ethan had been a soldier before he was a rancher. He'd come home from Afghanistan 10 years ago with a limp in his soul rather than his legs. The ranch, once shared with his father, had become both refuge and prison. His father's death 2 winters ago left him with too much land and too little reason to care for it. Only Rex remained, a creature he trusted more than any man or woman alive. "What do you want?" Ethan's voice was low and dry, the kind that didn't need to shout to command silence. Grace swallowed. "I heard you might be looking for help," she said. "I can cook, clean, do whatever needs doing." He studied her for a long moment, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. "You alone?" She nodded. "Got family?" "No, sir." "Experience?" "I worked on a farm back in Kansas." That seemed to satisfy him just enough to keep talking. He crossed his arms, glancing at the bundle in her hands. Too small for a life, too large for comfort. "You can stay if you work, but don't expect much. You're here only to cook. Nothing more." The words hit her like the dry wind, but she only nodded. "Yes, sir." He turned toward the porch. "There's a pump by the barn if you need water. The kitchen's in the back. Don't touch the study." Grace followed him through the yard. The air smelled of dust, wood, and horses. Rex trailed close, keeping pace beside her. His gait was silent but sure, his head turning now and then to glance at her, as if reassessing his decision to trust. Inside, the cabin smelled of stale coffee and disuse. Dishes were stacked in the sink, clothes draped over a chair, and a faint layer of dust coated everything. Grace placed her bundle on the floor and took a slow breath. This, at least, was shelter. Ethan removed his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and motioned vaguely toward the stove. "You'll find flour, beans, maybe some cornmeal. Do what you can." "I'll manage," she replied softly. He hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding once and stepping out again. Through the window, she watched him walk toward the corral where a lone horse grazed. He moved like a man built from discipline, every gesture deliberate, measured, as if even his weariness had been trained to obey. Grace tied back her hair with a strip of cloth, rolled up her sleeves, and began to clean. Dust rose in golden spirals around her as she moved. Quiet, efficient, invisible. Rex sat by the doorway watching her. When she swept near him, he sniffed at the broom and wagged his tail once. It startled a faint smile from her lips, the first in months. Outside, the sun began to dip behind the ridge. The prairie turned to molten gold, and long shadows stretched across the yard. Ethan stood at the fence, one hand on the post, staring out toward the horizon where the light met the land. He didn't notice Grace in the window behind him, nor how the lines of his face softened slightly in that moment. Rex trotted out to join him, sitting at his side. Ethan glanced down at the dog. "You trust her already?" he muttered. Rex didn't move, just gave a low whine and looked toward the cabin. Ethan sighed, rubbing his jaw. "We'll see." The evening settled in, quiet except for the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Grace lit a lantern, its glow warming the rough wooden walls. She laid her thin blanket over the cot, the faint smell of soap rising from freshly washed sheets. Her hands trembled only when the silence grew too deep. In the barn, Ethan worked until dark, mending a broken gate hinge. He didn't know why the sound of someone else moving inside his house, someone gentle, careful, felt so strange. For years, it had been only him and Rex and the ghosts of the past. Now there was another presence, a woman whose eyes had the same quiet sadness he'd once seen in his own reflection. As night fell, a storm flickered faintly on the horizon, heat lightning painting the distant clouds in ghostly white. The ranch creaked and sighed, settling into uneasy rest. Inside the cabin, Grace blew out the lamp and lay awake, listening to the steady breathing of the dog outside the door. It was oddly comforting, that sound. Steady, loyal, alive. Out on the porch, Ethan leaned against a post, pipe glowing faintly in the dark. The moon rose pale over the plains. Somewhere beyond the fence, a coyote cried. He looked toward the cabin window, where a faint flicker of light had just gone out. He told himself she was just a hired hand, a stranger. But when Rex padded up beside him and sat down, the man sighed, voice low and uncertain. "She's only here to cook, old boy. That's all." Rex tilted his head, eyes gleaming in the moonlight, and gave a small huff, as if he didn't quite believe it. The wind carried that unspoken doubt into the darkness, across the lonely Wyoming fields, where two souls and a dog began the slow, fragile work of unlearning solitude. Morning came pale and cold, the kind of light that flattened everything it touched. The frost still clung to the porch rails when Grace stepped outside, a tin bucket in one hand, her breath rising in fragile clouds. The ranch had a silence that was never truly quiet. Somewhere a horse snorted, the wind hummed against the barn walls, and from the far field came the faint groan of wood bending under age. It was a place that lived on in echoes. Grace moved through it like a ghost, learning to be human again. Inside the kitchen, she had already learned the rhythm of the house, the sound of Ethan's boots at dawn, the scrape of a chair pulled back, the measured pour of coffee into a chipped enamel cup. He said little, and she replied with even less. Still, there was a fragile truce forming between them, a silence not hostile, but cautious. Ethan Walker kept to himself, working long hours in the fields, his broad shoulders tense as if carrying invisible weight. His face was carved by years of labor and something older, something that had taught him to expect loss before it arrived. When he spoke, it was mostly to give instructions. He didn't ask questions about Grace's past, nor did she offer any answers. It was Jed Harper who first tried to bridge the quiet. Jed was 68, with a wiry frame and a face lined by sun and laughter in equal measure. His beard was a white stubble that caught the morning light, and his faded blue overalls hung loose on his thin frame. Once a traveling cattle driver, Jed had seen more states than he had teeth left, and he carried an easy warmth that softened even the sharp edges of Ethan's moods. To Grace, he was the only one who spoke without suspicion. "Mornin', miss," he greeted her as she hauled water from the well. "You move quiet as a church mouse. Ethan's got you working already, huh?" Grace smiled faintly. "There's plenty to clean. Doesn't seem like anyone's touched that kitchen in years." Jed chuckled, leaning on the fence post. "That'd be about right. The boss ain't much for housekeeping. Never was, not since—" He paused, the sentence hanging, unfinished. "Well, not since a while." Grace didn't press. People in pain often left their stories unfinished. By midday, the sun had softened enough for warmth to return to the yard. Grace hung a few washed linens on the line, their pale fabric snapping in the wind. Rex lay nearby, head on his paws, one ear twitching lazily at the sound of her humming. He had taken to following her from room to room, always close enough to see her, but never demanding attention. She found comfort in his quiet companionship. Ethan returned from the fields as the afternoon deepened. His shirt clung to him with dust and sweat. the veins in his forearms marked by the strain of lifting and mending. He stopped at the pump to wash his hands, glancing toward the figure bending over the water trough. Grace was struggling to lift a full bucket, her slender arms trembling with effort. As she shifted her grip, her sleeve slipped down to her elbow. For the first time, Ethan saw the faint bruises that marred her skin, yellow fading into purple, long finger-shaped shadows against pale flesh. Something in him stilled. He had seen marks like those before, on soldiers, on civilians, on the broken bodies left behind by cruelty that wore a human face. He turned away before she noticed him looking. Grace finished her task, unaware of his gaze. She felt only the sting of the cold metal against her hands and the ache in her back from bending too long. When she turned to set the bucket down, Rex was there, close enough that his nose brushed her wrist. She froze, then smiled, scratching behind his ears. "You're not so fierce after all," she whispered. Rex gave a quiet huff and settled beside her feet. When Ethan came closer, the dog stayed where he was, his eyes flicking between them like a silent witness. "You don't have to haul all that yourself," Ethan said finally, his tone less harsh than before. Grace straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. "I'm fine, Mr. Walker." He nodded, uncertain, as though the right words had abandoned him years ago. "Supper at 6, he muttered and walked away. That evening, the scent of cornbread filled the cabin. Grace moved gracefully between stove and table, her hair tied back, the glow from the fire painting her skin in amber tones. Jed joined them, lowering himself into a chair with a grunt. "Now this is a change," he said, grinning at Ethan. "Didn't know your kitchen still worked." Ethan gave a half smile. Guess it needed the right hands. Grace didn't look up, but a faint blush touched her cheeks. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Rex lay under the table, tail occasionally thumping against the floor. When Grace dropped a piece of bread, he caught it before it hit the ground and looked up expectantly. Ethan's lips twitched, the smallest ghost of amusement crossing his face. After supper, Jed bid them good night and trudged off to his quarters behind the barn. Grace began clearing the dishes. Ethan lingered by the door, pipe unlit between his fingers. He watched her move, efficient, deliberate, careful in every motion. She was a woman who'd learned to take up as little space as possible, as if she feared even her existence might inconvenience someone. "You can leave those," he said finally. "It's better to finish now," she replied softly. He nodded, unable to argue. His gaze drifted to her wrist again, the sleeve now neatly rolled down. "If there's anything you need..." She shook her head quickly. "I have everything I need, sir." Ethan hesitated a moment longer before stepping outside. The night was still, the stars sharp against the black sky. He lit his pipe, the ember flaring red, then fading as he exhaled. Rex followed him out, settling near his boots. "She's hiding something," Ethan murmured. Rex's ears perked. The dog tilted his head, watching his master with eyes that seemed to know more than they should. "I'm not getting involved," Ethan continued, though his tone lacked conviction. "She's here to cook, nothing else." Rex gave a low rumble of sound, not quite a growl, but not agreement either. Ethan looked down at him. "Don't start with me," he muttered, though the words carried no bite. The lantern inside flickered once before going dark. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain that might never come. Ethan leaned back against the post, the weight of unspoken things pressing heavier than the night air. He thought of the scars he carried, those no one could see, and wondered, not for the first time, whether some wounds were meant to echo in others, so they might finally learn to heal. Rex lifted his head, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the pipe. Ethan met the dog's gaze and sighed. "She's only here to cook, old boy. That's all." But even as he said it, the words felt hollow. The wind shifted before the storm, turning the sky the color of bruised metal. Across the plains, the scent of rain rode the air, sharp, electric, full of promise and threat. The ranch dogs in neighboring fields began to bark. The horses grew restless, and even the chickens clucked nervously in their coop. Inside the Walker Ranch, Grace could feel the change before the first drop fell. The light had gone strange, dim and yellow, and everything seemed to hold its breath. It had been 2 weeks since she first came to the ranch. The days had fallen into rhythm. Ethan working from dawn until dusk, Jed tending to the horses and cattle, and Grace filling the spaces between with quiet labor. It was a fragile peace, the kind that might shatter with the wrong word. But rumors had begun to drift in from town, carried by travelers, merchants, and the few who still dared to pass through the ranch road. "Walker's keeping a woman up there," they said. "Some stray he picked off the road. Ain't decent, a man like him living alone with her." The gossip reached Mrs. Clara Turner, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as the pins she used for sewing. Clara was in her 40s, short and sturdily built, with hair the color of copper wire and a face creased by years of bitterness. She ran the dry goods store in town and treated every rumor like a coin to be polished and traded. She claimed to have once known Ethan's mother and felt it her duty to mind what's proper. When Clara came by one morning under the excuse of delivering supplies, she wasted no time. Standing in the doorway, her parasol dripping from the drizzle that had begun to fall, she fixed Grace with a narrow, judgmental gaze. "So you're the one," she said, her voice smooth but venom-laced. "Living under Ethan Walker's roof. Folks are talking, dear. You should know how it looks." Grace's hands froze around the flour sack she was carrying. "I only work here," she said quietly. Clara smiled, a thin, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Of course, that's what everyone says, isn't it?" She leaned closer. "You'd do well to mind your place. This town doesn't forgive a woman for being seen where she doesn't belong." Before Grace could reply, Ethan's voice came from behind. "That'll be enough, Clara." He stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor. His jaw was set, his eyes cold as winter stone. Clara's smile faltered, but she straightened her back. "Just trying to help," she said. "You've done plenty." His tone cut the air like a blade. "You can go now." Clara sniffed, gathering her shawl tighter. "Don't say I didn't warn you," she muttered before marching back to her wagon. When she was gone, silence filled the house. Grace kept her eyes on the floor. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said softly. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You didn't. People here just like to tear down what they don't understand." Still, the damage had been done. Grace felt the weight of every unseen stare, every whisper the wind might carry from town. That night, she couldn't sleep. The walls creaked in rhythm with her heart, and even Rex's steady breathing outside the door couldn't quiet her unease. By morning, the storm that had been brewing all week finally broke. The sky cracked open with thunder, and rain came in sheets so heavy it blurred the horizon. The corral flooded, fences sagged under the wind, and the cattle began to panic. Ethan, soaked through, shouted orders to Jed over the roar. Grace stood at the doorway watching the chaos. Jed, his hat pulled low, struggled to herd a frightened colt back into the barn. "Go inside!" Ethan shouted over the wind. But the kitchen roof had begun to leak, and water streamed down onto the stove. Grace rushed to move the pots and pans, trying to save what food she could. When she stepped out to the porch to call for help, lightning split the sky, and the world lit up in a blinding white. Ethan turned sharply, frustration breaking through the storm's noise. "Didn't I tell you to stay inside?" he barked. His voice, strained by exhaustion and rain, came out harsher than he meant. Grace flinched, the instinct old and immediate. "You never listen," he snapped, slamming the gate shut behind a drenched calf. "This isn't a place for someone who doesn't know how to stay out of trouble." The words hit harder than any wind. She froze where she stood, one hand gripping the porch railing. The rain plastered her hair to her face, her dress clinging to her thin frame. When she tried to speak, her voice broke. "I'm sorry." Ethan turned toward her, and that was when he saw it. Her sleeve had fallen back, revealing the long, dark bruises that climbed her forearm like shadows. The marks, deep and uneven, told a story he didn't need her to explain. He stood still, his breath catching. Grace noticed his stare and jerked her arm back, trembling. "It's nothing," she whispered, but the lie died on her lips. Rex, who had been pacing near the steps, gave a sharp bark and moved between them, tail low but firm, eyes locked on Ethan. The dog wasn't aggressive. He was protective. The message was clear. Ethan took a step back, his anger draining as fast as the rainwater down the steps. He looked at the woman before him, soaked, shaking, and small against the storm, and felt something inside him twist painfully. He had yelled not because she had done wrong, but because he was terrified. Terrified of what she reminded him of: the helpless, the broken, the left behind. And beneath that fear was guilt, for every time he'd looked away from suffering, pretending it wasn't his to mend. Without another word, he turned and walked into the downpour, his hands clenched into fists. The rain blurred his outline, swallowed him whole. Grace sank to her knees on the porch, the thunder drowning the sound of her sobs. Rex whined softly, pressing his head against her arm. She let her hand rest on his wet fur, her tears mixing with the rain. Out in the field, Ethan stopped beneath the dying light of a flickering lantern, the rain running down his face. He could still see the bruises every time he blinked. He could hear the sound of her voice, that small, breaking apology. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed, not for what he'd done, but for what he'd become. Behind him, Rex's lonely bark echoed through the storm, carrying something raw and wordless into the dark. The storm had passed, but its echo still clung to the land. The air smelled of wet soil and wood smoke, and puddles glimmered under the pale morning sun. Grace woke before dawn as she always did, but something in the air felt different. Lighter, quieter, though she couldn't say why. She dressed in her usual plain blouse and skirt, her sleeves carefully rolled down, and stepped outside. The sky stretched wide and clean above the Wyoming plains, as though trying to start over. Ethan was already in the yard, hammer in hand, repairing a section of fence the wind had torn loose. His hair was damp with sweat, and the early light caught the silver beginning to show near his temples. There was a focus in his movements, but gone was the edge of anger that had shadowed him before. He worked with quiet determination, every strike of the hammer steady, almost thoughtful. Rex trotted nearby, tail swaying lazily, occasionally stopping to sniff a post or watch his master's progress. The dog's coat, still drying from the rain, glistened under the sun, his strength and intelligence impossible to miss. When he spotted Grace, his ears perked, and he trotted over, nose nudging her hand in a greeting that felt almost human. She smiled faintly and scratched behind his ear. "Morning, Rex," she murmured. Ethan glanced up at the sound of her voice. "You're up early," he said. "Habit," she replied, brushing her damp hair from her face. He hesitated, then pointed to the water trough. "There's coffee. Jed made it before heading to the barn." "Thank you," she said softly, surprised at the civility in his tone. She poured herself a tin cup and watched as he continued to work. He was different this morning, more human somehow, less guarded. Over the following days, the change in Ethan deepened in small, quiet ways. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way Grace brushed her hair back when she was lost in thought, the soft hum she made while cooking, the care she took in setting aside a small portion of food for Rex before every meal. And though he didn't say it aloud, something about her steadiness soothed him. Jed Harper noticed it too. The old ranch hand had a knack for reading people, honed from years of trail life and hard lessons. One afternoon, as Ethan brought in a load of fence posts, Jed leaned against the barn door, pipe smoke curling lazily around his face. "You've been whistling again," Jed said with a grin, his voice rough from years of dust and tobacco. "Ain't heard that sound in a good while." Ethan snorted. "Don't recall I was." Jed chuckled, his eyes twinkling. Sure. Maybe it's the dog humming tunes now. Or maybe it's that gal in the kitchen. Rex sure seems fond of her." At the mention of Rex, the dog lifted his head as if in agreement. Ethan glanced toward the house where Grace was hanging laundry. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, faintly, the corner of his mouth lifted. Maybe Rex just has better judgment than most. Jed let out a laugh that echoed through the yard. "Rex picks his people careful, son. Seems he picked right this time." That evening, clouds began to gather again over the western ridge. By nightfall, the rain returned, not in fury this time, but in a steady, patient rhythm. Grace lit the oil lamp, the warm glow filling the small cabin. She stirred the pot of stew hanging above the hearth, while Ethan finished stacking firewood near the door. The sound of rain drumming on the roof mixed with the quiet crackle of fire, creating a strange peace neither of them dared disturb. When Ethan sat down at the table, he noticed a small detail: 2 plates instead of 1. For years he'd eaten alone. Now it felt almost foreign to see the second plate waiting. Grace hesitated before sitting across from him. "I made cornbread," she said softly. "Jed said you liked it." Ethan nodded, reaching for a piece. "Haven't had this since—" He stopped. "Since his father died," he wanted to say, but the words caught in his throat. She didn't press him, just offered a gentle smile and poured him coffee. The meal passed mostly in silence, punctuated only by the occasional roll of thunder. When they finished, Ethan helped her clear the dishes without a word. Grace glanced up, startled. "You don't have to, I know," he interrupted simply. "But I want to." Something in the quiet weight of those words made her heart twist. She handed him the last plate, and for the first time, their fingers brushed. Neither spoke, but the air between them shifted. Later, they sat near the fire as the storm deepened outside. Grace mended a tear in one of Jed's shirts, her fingers moving with quiet precision. Ethan sat nearby, watching the flames, his thoughts heavy and unspoken. Rex lay sprawled between them, his head resting across both their feet, his soft breathing the only sound between the crackle of the fire. "You've done a lot around here," Ethan said after a long pause. "House looks better than it's been in years." Grace smiled faintly, eyes still on her stitching. "It just needed care." "Maybe," he murmured. "But not everyone bothers to care." The room went still again. The light flickered across their faces, softening the scars, hers hidden under sleeves, his carved by time. After a while, he spoke again, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "You're stronger than you think, Grace." She froze, needle trembling between her fingers. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. No one had ever said that to her before. Not kindly, not without judgment. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade. There was no pity in his gaze, only a deep, steady respect, the kind that healed instead of hurting. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She turned away quickly, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "People don't mean them." "I do," Ethan said simply. The words hung there, soft but immovable. The fire crackled. Rex stirred, sighing contentedly as if to seal the truth of it. Grace looked at him again, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Only a small, broken smile that carried more gratitude than language could hold. Outside, the storm began to ease, the rain thinning to a drizzle. Ethan leaned back, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. Rex shifted closer, his head now resting across both of their boots. The fire burned low, casting gold light over the three of them, a man, a woman, and the dog who had learned to trust again. In that small cabin, with the smell of rain and wood smoke in the air, something fragile yet undeniable had begun to take root. The gossip didn't fade with time. It grew roots. In a town like Fair Creek, silence was rare and decency a performance measured by whispers. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the second storm, and though the ranch lay miles from town, the air around it felt heavy with the echo of other people's words. Grace could sense them even here, carried in on the wind that rattled the loose window panes, words sharp as thorns. A woman alone with a man like that. He must have lost his mind. It'll end badly, you'll see. Grace tried to ignore it, burying herself in chores that had once brought comfort, scrubbing the floors, kneading bread, mending Ethan's shirts. But each movement felt hollow now, mechanical. Ethan had changed since that night by the fire. There was warmth in his gestures, a gentleness that frightened her because it felt real, and that, more than the town's judgment, was what scared her most. Rex noticed her unease first. The German shepherd, now sleek and strong after weeks of good meals and care, had become her shadow. At 5 years old, his energy balanced perfectly between youthful alertness and the wisdom of instinct. He followed her from room to room, eyes steady, as if sensing her thoughts before she spoke them. When she packed a loaf of bread and a small tin of coffee in a cloth bundle one evening, he whined, pawing gently at her skirt. "I have to, Rex," she whispered, stroking his head. "It's better for him, better for all of us." Outside, the moon hung low and full, turning the plains silver. The wind was mild, carrying the scent of sage and the faint cry of a nightbird. Grace stood on the porch, her bundle beside her, heart pounding with the certainty that she was doing what was right. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. "Where are you going?" Ethan's voice was quiet, rough around the edges, like a man trying not to startle something fragile. He was still in his work shirt, sleeves rolled up, the faint smear of dirt on his forearm catching the moonlight. His face looked different under that light, less like a man carved from stone, more like one standing at the edge of losing something he didn't know how to keep. Grace turned, unable to meet his eyes. "You know why?" she said softly. "They'll keep talking, and you don't deserve that." He stepped closer, stopping just short of her shadow. "I've been talked about all my life, Grace. I stopped caring the day I buried my father." She shook her head. "It's not just you they'll talk about. It's me. I've been run out of one place already. I can't—" Her voice broke. "I can't watch it happen again." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. The wind rustled the dry grass around them, and the barn door groaned faintly in its hinges. Rex stood between them, his tail low, eyes moving from one to the other as if trying to make sense of their silence. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low, almost pleading. "If you go, Grace, it'll just be me and a dog who remembers too much." The words landed like stones in her chest. She turned away, blinking hard. "You don't mean that." "I do." He took another step forward. "You think I don't hear them? I do, every word, but they don't matter. They never did. You do." Grace's hands trembled as she gripped the railing. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why?" he asked, almost angry now, but it was an anger born of fear. "Because you don't believe them, or because you're afraid to." She didn't answer. Her silence was enough. Then Rex moved. The shepherd padded forward, picked up the faded blue handkerchief from her bundle, the one she'd used to wrap her bread, and carried it carefully to Ethan. He dropped it at the man's feet, then sat, tail brushing the porch floor. Ethan stared down at the dog, then at the cloth, before exhaling slowly. "You see that?" he murmured. "Even he knows you belong here." Grace covered her mouth, fighting the sob that rose in her throat. Ethan knelt, resting a hand on Rex's head. His voice softened, breaking like the edge of dawn. "I never trusted anyone but this dog, Grace. Not since the war. Not since people started dying for things that didn't mean anything." He lifted his eyes to her. "But when Rex trusted you, I didn't have a choice. I started to, too." Tears blurred her vision. "Ethan, I don't love out of pity," he interrupted. "I love you because you remind me of who I was before the world turned me to stone. You walk into silence and make it feel like a home again. You cook, you clean, you hum to yourself. And for the first time in 10 years, I can hear something other than regret." Grace stood frozen, every word unraveling the walls she'd spent years building. She stepped forward, her voice shaking. "I don't know if I can believe in love anymore." He looked at her with quiet certainty. "Then don't. Believe in me instead." Rex gave a small bark, breaking the tension, his tail wagging tentatively. Grace let out a trembling laugh through her tears. She knelt, placing her hand on the dog's head. "He believed first," she whispered. "Maybe that's enough." When she stood, Ethan reached for her hand, not forcefully, just enough for her to feel the warmth of his calloused palm. The moonlight fell between them like a blessing. Weeks later, the plains bloomed green again after the rains. The morning sun rose over the horizon, spilling gold across the ranch. A few close neighbors came, Jed among them, his face grinning beneath his gray mustache, as Ethan and Grace stood side by side before a simple arch of wildflowers. The ceremony was brief, honest, quiet. Grace wore a cream dress borrowed from Jed's late wife, its hem brushing the grass. Ethan wore his old soldier's jacket, freshly cleaned, the brass buttons dulled by years, but still proud. Rex sat between them, chest puffed, a red ribbon tied loosely around his neck. When the words were spoken and their hands joined, the dog barked once, sharp and clear, as if declaring it official. As the wind swept across the plains, the golden light touched everything, their faces, the cabin behind them, the endless fields beyond. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low. "Told you the gossip wouldn't last." Grace smiled, her eyes shining. "But this will." Rex looked up at them, tail thumping softly, and the camera of the mind would fade with that image. The three of them standing against the horizon, the storm long gone, the light finally finding its way home. When storms pass and the earth breathes again, something soft often grows in the places pain once lived. Ethan, Grace, and Rex found not just love, but a quiet miracle. The kind that doesn't come with thunder or light from heaven, but in forgiveness, trust, and the courage to stay when running away seems easier. Sometimes God's miracles aren't loud. They come in small moments. In a kind word after silence, a loyal friend with 4 legs, or a heart learning how to hope again. Grace thought she had lost everything, but God was not finished with her story. He sent her not rescue from above, but companionship beside her. A man who had forgotten how to feel, and a dog who remembered how to love. If you've ever walked through your own storm, may you remember, the light always finds a way back. No wound is too deep for God's mercy, and no life too broken for His healing touch. Hold on. Believe. Because even when you can't see Him, He's still working in the quiet. May God bless you, wherever you are watching from. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below about the miracles you've seen in your own life. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us. Faith still moves mountains, and love still heals hearts.